Hey guys, welcome back to another lovely evening in the sunny southwest. So today's video we're going to be talking about all about SUP boards. So most people, this is the kind of board that they go for, but then once you get comfortable on a SUP, you really want to be going one way or the other, pushing the boundaries in terms of length and width. So first thing we're going to start with is this one. So this is a 10x10 2 bare feet board. So this is a pretty standard all-round SUP that you can get. So this is the one which, if you do any lessons on a SUP, or if you're just starting out, this is likely to be the first one that you're going to be doing. So yeah, so it's really great in the sense that it's 10x10, so it's nice and long, which means you can paddle it pretty easily, and it's 34 wide. So really, as we'll see throughout this video, width is the key thing. So the wider the board, the more stable it is. So it's just really geared towards beginners and just makes it really nice and comfortable. So, and this particular inflatable is 4 inches wide. So what you'll find is you have an option of usually around 4 inches or 6 inches, and 6 inches tend to be stiffer, but they of course tend to have more volume, which means that they tend to take a little bit longer to inflate, and also means that they can take a bit more load. So if you're a larger paddler, definitely go for a thicker board. So as I said, this is a pretty standard one that everyone goes on. So what we're first going to do is then, if you're happy on this kind of board and you're looking to get another one, we're going to go longer first and yeah, see how that goes. So I bring your attention to this next board. So this is one of my favorite all-time boards. Actually, I'm not going to say that because all of these boards are some of my favorites, but this one in particular is called a Nash 1. It's 12'6" by 30 inches wide, and this is a really good board, and this kind of shape of board is what you really want to be stepping up from in terms of that one. So you can see it's a kind of more drawn in at the nose and at the tail. So, and it's just a really fun board for paddling much longer distances than on these ones. It's still nice and stable, 30 inches wide, but this one, as you can see, is a bit thicker. So this is 6 inches wide. That's partly because of its age. These were one of the first boards to come out, and they really just wanted rigidity. So these are really nice as well, in the sense that if you want to try out racing for the first time, these are what are called the NISCO, or the 1 class, where often at SUP events they'll have one of these boards that you can either hire, or if you've got your own then you can use, and it just means everyone's on the same page and it's only to do with your paddling. As you start, if you get into SUP racing, you tend to find a lot of it's about all the new kit and all of the kind of fastest boards. So it's just really nice if you want to get into racing just as an entry level. So the other thing to look at is whether you want a hard board. So these two boards are exactly the same dimensions. This one's called a starboard pin. It is ancient. It's one of our favorite boards to just play around on because it's just very, very, very robust, and it's getting pretty beat up these days. But it's the same dimensions, 12'6" by 30 inches wide. And really, this is one of the biggest kind of contentious topics in SUP, whether you go for an inflatable or a hard board. Both of these boards are touring boards. They're both the same dimensions. And obviously this one's a hard board and this one's an inflatable. This one's really nice in the sense it's got those D-rings on the front, which means you can stick your pack lunch or dry bag or something. It's really good to keep a phone with you as well if you're ever doing long distance paddles. So these are really nice in the sense that these inflatables, they're just so easy to store. You just chuck them in the back of your car, you don't need a roof rack, and they're just really, really easy to store. Unfortunately, when you're out on the water, they just don't feel the same as a hard board. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly with this inflatable, which I'll get to in a minute, you can pump up to about 21 PSI, which means that they're really, really rigid. But unfortunately, as rigid as they can get, they'll just never be as rigid as a hard board. The other advantage of inflatables over hard boards is if, you know, it's for your kids, or you're perhaps a little bit older and aren't as strong as some of the other paddlers, then these boards are really light. This board is heavy. It's probably near 10 kilograms worth of weight, and that can be really challenging if you're having to paddle it for a long distance. Whereas these inflatables, they're just made of air, so they're so light to carry. So often if I'm going down paddling and I'm taking some friends and I've got a mix of inflatables or hardboards, I'll give the inflatables to the people who are maybe a little bit weaker to carry down to the beach, and then we can swap around once we get down there. But it's a real advantage them being so light. Unfortunately, as I said, really the only downside of inflatables is feel, and that kind of really comes into play when you start paddling kind of properly and over long distances. You'll find inflatables just give a little bit. It's kind of inflatables are like having suspension on the front wheels of your bike. If you're pedaling, you can feel energy coming out through the springs, and inflatables are the same. As you're paddling, you can sometimes very subtly feel your feet pushing into the board. So that brings me very nicely onto this one, which is a 14-foot inflatable. This is one of my favorite boards of all time. The main thing is, if you're getting really good at paddleboarding and you think you can deal with something a little bit more wobbly, this board is 26 inches wide, but it's 14 foot long. So the really lovely thing about it is it's just massive. But of course, as soon as all of the air's out of it, it packs up into a rucksack like this one, which I'll hold up to the camera in a second. But really, my mantra with inflatables is that if you can, go for as long as possible, because they just shrink down into such a small size. I personally would never, I don't have the space for a 14-foot board, as we'll see. But a 14-foot inflatable is just so easy. And this one is 26 inches wide. So that means it's a little bit more wobbly on the water, and again, about 6 inches deep, which makes it nice and rigid. But the really nice thing about this one is you have this little hole here, which you can't really see on the camera, but I'll just put this down again and I'll show you what goes in that hole. So what they have on these Red Paddle Co boards is these battens like this, which initially you think they're a bit floppy, probably don't give you a huge amount of rigidity. But as a mechanical engineer, I can tell you in this plane, which is the plane that they're flexing in, they're extremely stiff. They don't sit on the board like this, but they sit sideways, and that really makes a difference. So they sit up around about here where you stand, and it just, again, it's one of those things where the key thing with inflatables is to try and get them to be as light as possible, lighter than hardboards with the feel of a hardboard. So I would highly recommend getting the longest, narrowest board that you can get away with. But of course, this board in particular, if it's a little bit choppy, it can get quite wobbly. So, but it's just fantastic for paddling long distances, and it's just one of my favorite boards to use. It doesn't have D-rings in the same way that you can see, but those two little handles on the front, you can actually clip a dry bag through them, so it's fine. Okay, cool. So just to recap very quickly, this board's great to start out on, but I imagine if you're watching this video, this is very similar to what you maybe already own or have tried. What happens is we start narrowing the width. So this one's 34, this one's 30, and these two are 30 inches wide, and this one's 26 inches wide. So what that gives you is, as you can see with this one, it's much more streamlined, much more like a canoe. And just that means that you can just paddle a little bit faster, but is more wobbly. That's the constant toss-up that we have in stand-up paddleboarding. So you might also be thinking, but Rob, I don't want to do any more flat water paddling. What I want to do is surfing. That's the whole reason that I got this board, and the whole reason I've been looking at it, and it's got 3 fins in it. So first thing, straight out of the gate, is surfing inflatables can be really fun. The other nice thing about this one having narrow rails is that means that you can turn it a little bit more. But really, if you're really wanting to get into surfing, that's again where hardboards have the edge. That's because they have these really defined rails. So I'll show you on this one. So you see how this rail, it's just the same the whole way around. It's just really kind of nice and curved. But unfortunately, in the case of our Jimmy Lewis, which which we have here, you can see how the rails aren't symmetrical in this case. I'll just bring the camera so it's like that. So you can see the rails are much more distinguished, and crucially, they thin out towards the back here. It's much more pronounced in the shorter boards, which I'll try and show you as well a bit later on. So this is ancient, this board, so you probably can't get hold of one like this anymore. But this is just a really good example of, so this board is 10 foot 10 and this one is 10 foot. But this one is 34 inches wide and this one's 28 inches wide. So you can see how they're fundamentally the same shape, but just by the fact that it's narrower, it's just going to give you a little bit more speed when you're trying to paddle into a wave. We'll cover how to paddle surf and the basics of paddle surfing in a different video, but this is really just to talk about the kind of board that you're going to want to be after. So you can also surf like 11 foot 2 boards. That tends to be the kind of upper range. But you can also surf, we've surfed these 12 foot 6s, which is a lot of fun, but pretty scary. So really, if you're first getting into paddle surfing, you're going to want, ideally, a hard board around about 10 foot and not much under 30 inches wide, because you just want to be really comfortable when you're catching your first few waves. The other thing is, at this length, we don't really need to worry about volume just yet, but we'll worry about volume as we work our way down. Cool. So again, you may come back to me and say, Rob, I've done this, but I'm really getting into my surfing. I've done a few turns, so I really want to know how to progress my surfing. So that's where we're going to go along to this group, and we're just going to fly through these a little bit. So we're not sponsored by Nash, by the way, but these boards are just some of our favorite boards that we've kind of been stuck with. They're just a really nice shape that we've stuck with all the way through our surfing progression. So these 3 boards are called Nash Hokuas. They've been around for ages, almost as long as I've been paddleboarding. And you can see, similar to the kind of longer shapes, they're this very aggressive, kind of pulled in tails and very pointy noses. And what that means is, when you catch the wave, you can do some very carving turns. And whereas on something that's longer, you'll find that you have to stand on the back and you have to kind of pivot the board round on the tail of the board. Whereas if you see with this one, again, I'll put it this way. So you can see we've got a little bit of rocker on the top, and it's fat around where you stand. It's probably about the same thickness as a lot of our inflatables, but crucially, look at how narrow that section is. So that's where you're standing when you're on the wave. So you actually can carve the board on these really sharp, defined rails on these longer boards. And really all that happens is, as we go down in length, it's the same story, but the sweet spot in the middle where you stand, which on these boards is huge, the sweet spot in the middle where you stand gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's where volume starts to become very important. So, for example, this one is a 9 foot Hokua. Sorry, I should have told you the dimensions. So on a lot of these surfboards as well, you have the dimensions along the bottom here. So raise it up a bit. So you've got Hokua 9 foot by 28 3/4 inches wide. All right, so it's actually slightly wider than this one, which you can probably just about see. So that's a really nice thing to do. Get a nice long, narrow board and then go down to a shorter board, but maybe of the same width. And then as you start getting shorter and shorter, you start having to contend with not only wobbling side to side, but wobbling backwards and forwards. So this is another logical step down. This one's 9 foot. So the smaller you go, you start going down in half feet. So this one is a Hokua 8.5. And yeah, you can see similar story, nice and fat around where you stand and then thinning out towards the rails. We'll probably do another video on kind of different fin setups. And you see you've got this rocker, which you don't have with the longer boards. So that's that one. And now this is where it starts getting really interesting. So I'm going to do these two boards together. So what I would say is, this board is really great for when you first start learning out, this 10 foot, and then these ones are your kind of logical step down. That's when you start getting turns and that kind of stuff. But these two are your kind of minimum that you can go to in terms of length and volume. So these are probably high performance surfboards. So the reason for this is I'm 80 kilograms, and a really good standard rule to go for is it's whatever your weight is in kilograms plus 10 is the minimum liters that you can probably stand on. So again, for much longer, much higher volume boards, it shouldn't really matter unless you're a kind of big, strong guy and you're pretty heavy. Really, it's once you start getting down to these performance boards that it really starts to make a difference. And I'll try and put in some pictures and some videos of me standing on these, because the surprising thing is these ones are logical in the sense that the boards are above the water. These ones, really, this much and up of the board should be above the water. And it becomes a thing where you are trying to balance in all directions. So just to talk about them briefly, I'm actually going to start with this one because it will make more sense. So this is a 7'5". This is one that I got made for me by Charlie Gray. And I partly got it made for me because at the time there were not that many production boards around that did this, but there's loads of them around, so it's fine now. And also, importantly, a really big second-hand market for paddleboards now as well. So I'm just going to take some of these snails off. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about the different thicknesses of the board. So as you can see, you've got a little bit of rocker at both. So rocker is it's scooping up at the front and scooping up at the back. So you've got a little bit of rocker in this one, but the key thing is the fat section is now around about here and actually very far forward. So what that means is you can brace against, because it's easier to lean forward than it is to lean on your heels on a paddleboard. By having more of the volume further forward in the nose, it gives you something to brace against. So, and which again, something that you hopefully will be able to see in a video. So, and again, with this one, the tail is really pulled in at the back and really defined rails. So this board is at around about 90 litres. It's hard to say exactly, but which is more or less perfect for me. And it is 26, I think, 26 inches wide. So amazingly, it's the same as my longest board, 26 inches wide, which is pretty well as narrow as I can go personally. And what that means is it's really as streamlined as it possibly can be. As you can see, it's pretty short and fat, but it's as streamlined as I can bear for it to take. But then also is wide enough that I can stand on it and that it's got a lot of volume. Coming to the other board. So this board is great for really short, really steep faces that you can get in kind of north coast of Cornwall and all of those kind of places, a lot of places in France. But what it really lacks in is down the line speed because it's so short and fat. So it tends to be, it's really great for just turning on a sixpence and it can just slash water around no problem. Whereas this board, which is actually even narrower, I'm going to have to try and remember how narrow it is. Yeah, so this one's 26 as well, but crucially, and this is where I've slightly broken the rules, this board is only 80 litres and it's made entirely of carbon fibre, which makes it supremely light. And you can see, because it's 8 foot long, it actually, even though it's got more length, it's actually lighter and lower volume than this one, which means that it's really, really quick down the line and just extremely streamlined. And also one thing that I just want to show you in terms of how light these boards are, you can see in terms of where the handle is on all of these longer boards. If you look at where the handle is on this board, it is not where you would expect it to be. And that is because these boards are so light that the fins add a real weight to them. So the handle is moved much further back so that it can be balanced. And again, same story, more volume in the kind of nose and the center of the board, and really, really drawn out tails. Okay, so thanks for sticking with us so far, if you have already. I understand a lot of people are going to be kind of at a stage and want to know how to move on to the next stage. But I just wanted to talk briefly about kind of moving on from paddle surfing. So what we have here, you think, wow, that's a pretty crazy looking SUP board. And it's actually because this is a SUP foil board. It's 6'10" and it's 100 litres. So plenty for me to stand on. But the reason that these foil boards can be so much shorter than anything that you could usually stand on a paddleboard is because they usually have a big hydrofoil in the bottom, which really acts as like a keel on a sailing boat. So they add way more stability than you can usually get away with. So it means that really with foil boards, you're trying to get as little board out of the water as possible. So that's why I can get away with something like a 6'10", which I have here, which I could never get away with. Oh, and I just ought to say this is 26 wide as well. So 26 wide for me personally is my kind of comfortable. I could go narrower, but I probably wouldn't be able to stand on it for very long. And then just finally, if any of you out there have really enjoyed SUP surfing and going, actually, you know, I've got pretty good at SUP surfing, but I'd really like to have a go at normal prone surfing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this board, which is my surfboard shortboard, which I got about 2 years ago now. Again, just went along to a surf shop and said, look, I'm, you know, pretty good at SUP surfing, but I'd love to take up prone shortboarding again. And the key thing that they recommended is pretty high volume, 40 litres, because you're used to the kind of corkiness of these paddle boards on a wave. And also not too short. This is 6'4", so that's the kind of longer end of a shortboard. So I just thought that's kind of point of interest really, just in case you wanted to flip-flop between the two. I've loved this board and it just feels like shortboard paddle surfing, except without the paddle. And speaking of paddles, I just thought I'd quickly talk about different paddles that you can get, and then I'm going to talk about leashes as well. So this 2 bare feet one comes with a really nice aluminium paddle, which comes in 3 bits, which again is pretty standard in terms of paddles that you can get included, and it's adjustable. So these are all pretty easy. And again, just like with the first inflatable you get, these are fantastic as a first paddle. They're really easy, really rigid, but unfortunately they're pretty heavy. So after a while, if you're going a long distance, you're really going to notice these ones. So instead, what you can do is you then have the option of carbon paddles. So carbon paddles now are much cheaper than they used to be, and I definitely recommend getting one. If you're kind of looking at spending some money and getting some really and a really nice board, then a really nice paddle to go with it is really good. So, and they don't have to be brands. So Quick Blade and kind of brands like Starboard and Nash, they all have their own paddles, which are all really great and all super light. But you don't have to go with those, and you don't have to break the bank. But they are, you know, great for performance. So instead, I've got an off-brand paddle here that just got made for me by a friend of mine. And these are really nice because they're fixed, and all you do is cut them to the length that you want, stick it down with some 3M glue, and it's really straightforward. Some people find hot glue gunning the handle as well. Just means that if it's not quite in the right place, you can just heat it up, pull the handle out, cut it down to another place, and it's really nice and easy. So the fantastic thing about these ones is they're as rigid and as light as you can possibly get. Unfortunately, what it means is if you want to do distance paddling and surf paddling, so you tend to have a really short paddle for surf paddling and a really long paddle for distance, it just means that you have to buy 2 paddles. You know, you can use one, but you'll find it uncomfortable in one or the other. So the alternative is get one of these, which are carbon adjustable paddles. So, and this one is really light. Amazingly, you know, that one's a couple of years old, and this one as an adjustable paddle is lighter than those. So these we got from Decathlon about 3 or 4 years ago now. And they're just really durable. And again, we just picked them up expecting them to be really heavy. We were kind of doing it slightly out of smugness, and they're just so light and so durable. And it just means that these are the only paddles that we own now. Again, no product placement because no one's sponsored here yet. Yeah, they're just really lovely and light. So we use these for distance, we use these for surfing, we use these for foiling. They're just really super versatile. So I couldn't recommend them enough. But again, any branded carbon paddle will also be really good. And that's it really. I'm just gonna, again, very briefly talk about leashes. So there's 2 types of leashes that you can get. You can get these coil spring leashes, which these ones are really good in the sense that they hold themselves out of the water and they don't get in the way and add extra drag. So with this one, I would add it to any of these inflatables, probably this hardboard as well, and the 14 foot. Some people also wear buoyancy aids, which is really important if you're kind of not confident with the water. But often if you wear a leash, it means that you have that buoyancy if you can keep close to the board. So I personally don't wear one when I'm distance paddling, but that's just personal preference. I certainly would never discourage people from wearing personal flotation devices. So, but when you start surfing, really you want a straight leash, and that's because the manner in which straight leashes stretch, and they tend to be as long as the board. That's another rule of thumb. Whereas these coil leashes, these boards can be pretty heavy, and in the waves they can really spring back and you can really hurt yourself. Whereas straight leashes, it just means that it will stretch out, but it won't ping back. You instead pull the leash back in. So again, straight leash, straight leash, straight leash, straight leash, straight leash, except if you're foiling, and then you go back to one of these, and that's because a straight leash will get wrapped around your foil, and it's just really annoying, and it can get wrapped around and pull you off as you're going along. So again, back to a coil leash for this one. But as well, personally, because I know the board is going to be springing back in waves, I wear a helmet and an impact vest. And we'll do another video on kind of what kind of safety equipment you would need in various different water sports. So that's it in terms of boards progressing down. As again, I'll say it again, the key thing is volume and width. So if you start out on this one, you don't even need to worry about volume and width, it's got loads. But as you want to do more touring and more racing, you want to increase your length and decrease your width, but volume is not really such a concern. And then as you go down in surfing, you're trying to decrease your length and decrease your width. So you really have to keep an eye on how much volume you've got to play with. And that's it. Thanks guys. If you like this video, like and subscribe, and press the bell below. All of our social medias are in the description below. And yeah, have a good one out there.